think multi-agent is a really natural pattern. It vaguely reminds me of when we moved to like microservices and you sort of had these services that were all responsible for one specific thing. I think more and
Mm.
more organizations are finding they will be building domain specific or sort of task specific agents, but they don't want to rebuild that in the context of every single agent they're going to go build or every multi-agent piece. I think everyone's seen, I'm sure on LinkedIn, it's like weekly, there's a post where it's like an agent deleted by production database. And it's like, okay, well, why did the agent have permission to your production database kind of question?
Right.
And so I think everyone's trying to prevent that scenario, but
Yeah.
I think the fear is starting to go away as more and more of these constructs come to place and they feel like
Mhm.
they're starting to get more of that sort of enterprise level control over things. I think the industry itself is also still trying to figure out a bunch of these patterns because agents work better with context. You may not want to give them all the context that maybe the agent thinks it needs. And so, how do you do this in a safe way? I think something we've tried to enforce, at least initially, and then I think we're going to continue to evolve it as we hear from our customers and more patterns emerge.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Future Proof. Today I'm talking to Elise Gonzalez, who's a staff PM at Databricks. We talked today about how Databricks is thinking about their AgentBricks platform, where they allow customers to connect MCPs. We talk about all the privileges and the governance that need to be accounted for when you allow users to connect any kind of MCPs to the platform. And also how to think about multi-agent architecture. If you're starting to think that your tasks are complex enough to start reusing or bundling across different sub-agents within a larger agentic workflow. So really excited for you to hear from Elise about some of these lessons that she's learned and how she's thinking about some of these problems. So stay tuned. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Future Proof. Today, I'm joined by Elise Gonzalez, who is a staff PM at Databricks. She oversees the AgentBricks product and the MCP marketplace offered in Databricks. So, Elise, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Super excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah. So I would love to learn first just about AgentBricks, the platform in general, and what you're seeing customers do with the MCP marketplace. What are some of the exciting use cases that customers are building on top of AgentBricks today?
Yeah, great question. So I would say AgentBricks is really our platform for building agents inside of Databricks. We started at our summit last year or earlier this year, actually. Feels like it's been a long time. Introducing a few very common use cases that we see. So, information extraction, when you want to extract, let's say, certain columns or certain values out of unstructured data. So, all of your docs. Often we see legal contracts, invoices, that kind of thing that people need, often have many of, and they need sort of commonalities between all of those different docs. As well, we also have a knowledge assistant agent. And so, what this lets you do is talk to your docs. So, rather than sort of extracting info out of them, you can actually chat with them. Again, we see very domain specific data problems there where we have a customer who has around 60,000 regulatory documents. They're an electrical company. And so they have to make sense of all of these different regulations they have to follow, changes year over year. And so asking questions of that can really help them. As well as we now as well have a multi-agent supervisor. And so this lets you start to compose these different domain specific agents together. So often we see people combining structured and unstructured data across sort of different categories within their company. So I'm working with a pharmaceutical company. They want to look at market research for different drugs as well as past financial performance and give information to their field team there to better talk to potential customers. And then for our MCP catalog and marketplace, what we see is often people are discovery is a really big problem with MCP. So I've talked to a number of customers where they've had two or more teams actually create almost the exact same set of tools and almost the exact same MCP server. And so what the marketplace helps you do is discover servers that are out there from vendors that you already likely have a relationship with, but you may not know they have an MCP server. And so being able to build that into your agents built on something that that company already has can really help with that agent development lifecycle. And then the catalog itself helps you discover the ones that you have access to, helps provide governance on top of MCP, which when we're talking about enterprises, that is something they're really concerned about is how do you start to control how MCP behaves, who gets access to what. And so starting to provide that surface for them directly integrated with our Unity catalog product.
Cool. Yeah, that's super cool that you can actually, have that marketplace be a place where customers can actually discover vendors that they might have relationships with and really plug into the MCP tools that they might have. And certainly that's so much of the excitement we see over MCP today is this idea that agents can essentially have more context over the external or outside world knowledge that might be going on past training cutoffs, but also access to internal knowledge as well through MCP, the protocol. And I'm curious, there's been a lot of maybe early discussion about not just how humans might discover MCPs and register them in from a catalog, but also a potential future where those servers are automatically discovered and distributed. I'm curious what your vision for that future marketplace might be, and kind of how that fits into your product vision for the Unity catalog.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I would say this is one of those spaces that's evolving pretty rapidly, and so it's something we're both pushing on and keeping up with. And so I would say right now, organizations do really want a pretty large amount of control. And so I think the world where immediately we introduce new servers into their catalog or they sort of automatically discover them, I think that's pretty scary for most folks right now. And so I think we're going to wade in there very cautiously. I have a lot of conversations with customers, and so we're really customer driven. And I want to make sure we fit what they're most comfortable with, what they need from a security and sort of enterprise readiness perspective. But we have seen very recently, MCP itself came out with this registry concept. And so companies can potentially post a registry where they like host their MCP server. It gives you all of the latest tools, information, versioning, things like that, as well as a company can become a registry. And so as you have that registry link, you could plug it into something like Cursor, get access to all the MCP servers that you have access to. And so that is a plan. We will move in that direction and sort of support that as the MCP spec does. I think more and more what we really want in our marketplace are high quality, validated MCP servers. And so trying to provide that reassurance to our customers that, like, hey, this really did come from our partner u.com, or this really did come from our partner Glean. And so they feel like they can trust that connection more. But often they really do want that level of control. And so I think we will surface more and more of these in the marketplace, but it'll still ultimately be up to enterprises to decide what they do and don't allow. And more permissively, they may be able to just sort of automatically add new tools and servers into their catalog.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, before we kind of have all of these pieces of automated discovery, it makes a ton of sense that we'd have to start with enterprise trust and making sure that, people still have control over what data gets accessed and what capabilities are possible within those agents. So how are you thinking about that governance? Like, walk me through sort of the validation process of how you're onboarding MCP servers into this catalog to make sure that it is a catalog that your largest enterprise customers can really trust when they plug it in.
Yeah. So for our marketplace listings, what we do is we actually work right now directly with the partners. So we actually go through and have them test and add their MCP server to their own Databricks environment, show us it's actually working. It has the tools that it's expected to, and then we'll sign off on it, and they can list that in the marketplace. And then it's really up to each enterprise as they sort of discover these in the marketplace if they want to add it to their catalog. It's right now restricted to platform administrators. And so it's a pretty limited scope in terms of who's allowed to add to the catalog. And then you grant additional permissions on top of that, where just because you added one to your catalog doesn't mean everyone gets permissions to it. And so you can kind of decide both based on OAuth scopes as well as who's in your organization, who is allowed to leverage that server. And then we can also do additionally like auth and token exchange. So we can make sure if I'm using GitHubs, for example, it's registered as me. I can pass through that sort of token and user information. And so that way it's me operating in GitHub rather than, let's say, a service principal with many, many permissions and you can't track actually who's using it. And so giving, I would say, multiple layers of governance and multiple layers of permissions and control that fits well with our Unity catalog governance model. And so that's really where we want to push on is how can you govern both your data and AI together? And that's often what we hear customers are trying to do is they want to bring AI to their data and they also want to bring their data to AI. And so how do they govern those alongside, make sure they're not granting accidental permissions, but they also don't necessarily want to have to approve every single, server request someone has. So how can they hand that to the right people in their organization to make some of those decisions, but still have an overarching auditability and sense of control?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting. It kind of sounds like what you've built is sort of an agent architecture that's multi-tenanted with respect to what users are talking to the agent, but also what capabilities they do have, if I'm hearing you correctly, right? So it kind of sounds like individual people interacting with the agent have their own kind of scopes and authentication into the MCPs that the agent also has access to.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So not only are they granted by the admin whether or not they're allowed to use a server, we actually do pass along that user information too to make sure, let's say in GitHub, I don't have delete repo, for example, but that is a tool that's offered. I should not be allowed to do that, for example, but also providing that broad scale of auditability and logging what people are doing so that even if, let's say, in the case something does happen, how do you figure out what happened? And so starting to centralize some of that I think in a platform is what a lot of companies are craving just because it's a lot to track down and there's a lot of sprawl of servers, a lot of sprawl of agents. And so they need some sort of like single pane of glass and control center essentially. And so that's what we're trying to help them build out.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that makes sense that you would sort of also rely on the identity provided by the MCP servers with respect to the actual user that's interacting with the agent. I think that's a pattern that we're actually seeing more and more Paragon customers also leverage, where people are creating these individual connections with the service to make sure that the agent is only using that service with the same capabilities and scope that they're logged in as, which, it sounds straightforward, but it took us a little bit of time to really get there from a protocol standpoint with MCP. I'm curious, like beyond those kind of user level authentication and kind of assuming the same roles as the user that's talking to the agent, are there any other ways that your team is thinking about preventing accidental data leakage or like, over permissioning certain connections?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's definitely something we're continuing to iterate on. Very similar to you, it turns out authentication, token exchange, making sure tokens don't get exposed, super hard. And so I think it sounds like we've been in a similar boat here, especially as MCP itself has been evolving how Auth works. So many moving pieces in the puzzle. So one thing we are considering is we are hearing more and more people want individual tool level control. So not only the server itself, but let's say in that GitHub example, maybe you never want someone to delete repo, even if they have the permission to do it, but you never want that to happen through an agent. How can they provide that level of sort of tool control as well? And so as we integrate further into our Unity catalog, potentially surfacing tools under our sort of catalog schema structure so that you could control them in a very similar way to controlling sort of tables, models that we have today. And I would also say this is something we're keeping an eye on. So I think the spec itself is evolving, the space is evolving. And so we want to see what patterns emerge and see what makes sense for us to integrate with. And so as maybe something comes out in the market that people really like and adopt, similar to MCP itself, that would be a direction we'd also move in.
Yeah, yeah. And it's super interesting how some of these permissioning and authorization ideas are evolving. It kind of reminds me of like the MCP equivalent of the self-driving problem, where people are like, they have a higher standard for like how, the safety of self-driving cars. And similarly, we kind of are applying the same idea to agents that just run, can sort of run rampant over the tools and capabilities that they have access to. And we're, taking even more steps than we would maybe through than a traditional login or traditional roles. But overall, it helps with governance and auditability of what the agents are doing with those tools. So yeah, super interesting, but I think generally an improvement to the ecosystem overall.
Yeah, for sure. I think MCP overall has definitely been a big improvement, but it's had to evolve pretty significantly from the world where people just running local servers on their laptops and just, hacking away at it versus like how do you make this an enterprise solution? How do you make it so servers can talk to each other? And so it has been, I think, overall great and I think the industry itself has spoken. It was one of the first standards I think that was adopted super widely. But there's definitely, I think, still some challenges with it. I know, like with the registry concept that I mentioned, they're still working out Auth. And so they've now sort of introduced the V1. Auth is not yet solved. And so this is going to be something that keeps evolving. And so I think we all have to be relatively responsive to how it works, but also I think push what we know for our customers makes the most sense, similar to you needing to provide that like user identity and sort of auditability. We feel the same way. And so I think more and more patterns like that will emerge. But yeah, it feels like self-driving cars. It also feels like, I don't know, REST APIs part two, where it's like we were figuring all of this out for APIs. Now we're doing it again in the world of agents. And so how many times, I'm sure we'll keep repeating this kind of pattern. But I think people do have a higher standard. They're I think everyone's seen, I'm sure on LinkedIn, it's like weekly, there's a post where it's like an agent deleted by production database. And it's like, okay, well, why did the agent have permission to your production database kind of question?
Right.
And so I think everyone's trying to prevent that scenario, but
Yeah.
I think the fear is starting to go away as more and more of these constructs come to place and they feel like
Mhm.
they're starting to get more of that sort of enterprise level control over things.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw someone's opinion online. I'm forgetting who wrote this now, but on the REST API versus MCP piece, like one interesting idea was that uh, the biggest contribution that MCP provided to the ecosystem is just giving people a way to redo their API. Like if they were able to just like, throw out their API and start from scratch, how would they do it? And how would they do it from the operating standpoint of not necessarily an app, but just like a this model that can just call individual tools, which is interesting. Like I think the protocol itself again is pretty lightweight. It's very similar to some of the ideas that we already had in REST, but it did people kind of give people a reset, like rethink how machines are going to access the data out of your platform and what are the most natural and safe ways that they can do that. I think that was just an interesting idea. That it did give us collectively an opportunity to rethink APIs.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. I would say it feels like we're still pretty nascent, where I'm still finding often people are just taking their REST API and sort of wrapping it in as an MCP server and being like, here you go. But I think the next evolution will be tools that are evolved specifically for agentic workflows. And I think we're starting to see this more and more as people publish their own MCP servers versus these sort of like community driven and community developed ones. And so I think exactly like you said, you could combine multiple APIs and maybe you don't have to redo your entire API stack in that case. But I think it has given us a way to at least standardize and sort of, to your point, I think redo some of those REST APIs and some of the things we've done there and think more about maybe the use case versus just the technology underneath.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I feel like at Paragon we kind of got lucky in this regard. So as a bit of company history, we started as a workflow automation platform. It's essentially like a low-code visual workflow builder, and we spent a few years building out these like abstractions over people's APIs to be more like operating use cases that humans would use the app with instead of the API itself. So we spent a lot of time not wrapping essentially these API operations because there could be like many API ops involved in one thing a human wants to do. And then like this agent revolution started and we were like, wait a second, we have this huge catalog of tools that we've been building over many years, like
Right.
doing this exact thing. And yeah, I think you're totally right that like the ecosystem does need to move in that direction where people are building for agents specifically and not just, beyond just like wrapping each individual endpoint, which I think what we've seen from customers essentially trying to do the same thing is that it's pretty inefficient as far as like, how many tool calls it requires the agent to succeed. And
And how
yeah,
much
just generally
context
not
it
as accurate.
uses and how much,
Yes.
yeah, exactly, how much is like being passed around. And there's often a tool limit depending on what client you're using, and so Cursor I think is like 40 tools, although they may have expanded that recently. And so I think you have to think about it in the context of, hey, it's not just someone using your API, they're also going to likely use other tools. You need to think about token limits and context windows. And so I think that evolution to hopefully agentic use case based tools will be welcome, I think, by a lot of people. And it makes total sense that that's how you were sort of thinking about it as you were building out workflows versus I don't think anyone in a step in a workflow is like crud. You're like,
Right.
okay, I don't know what that means. And so it's like, what are you actually trying to do? It may be multiple API calls in there.
Yes, yes, definitely. And kind of speaking of future agentic patterns, I actually heard you kind of allude to this already with something that Databricks already offers through the AgentBricks product. But multi-agent architecture, I think it's something that is on people's minds, and I think in some ways multiplies some of the existing permissioning and auditability problems that single agents have working with users. I'm curious how you're thinking about or maybe even providing the safeguards for customers to configure around multiple agents calling different MCP tools and coordinating safely to prevent privilege escalation or leaking context, all the same issues, just like, like how do you prevent that from compounding once you have a bunch of agents working together?
Yeah, the amplification problem, right, is like you start with one agent, it already has these problems, you start to add them together. How do you prevent some of this? So yeah, so we built a couple of things into our multi-agent supervisor to help with this, but this will be somewhere where we continue to evolve, especially as more and more of this evolves. I think multi-agent is a really natural pattern. It vaguely reminds me of when we moved to like microservices and you sort of had these services that were all responsible for one specific thing. I think more and
Mm.
more organizations are finding they will be building domain specific or sort of task specific agents, but they don't want to rebuild that in the context of every single agent they're going to go build or every multi-agent piece. But as we've really built out our multi-agent supervisor, given sort of the strong focus on governance, that's been a big component we've really thought about. And so as we've started this, we have started with agents inside of Databricks. And the thing that we do enforce is on behalf of user auth all the way through. So you do need access to each of the sub agents. If they access tables, for example, you need access to the tables underneath, and you will get an error or the agent actually won't even be loaded into the sort of multi-agent context if you don't have access to that sub agent. And so that is something that we are enforcing all the way down, including through MCP. So as we have these MCP servers in our catalog, you'll need access to those as well. And so really starting to leverage this permissioning model that we've built out and pushing that down through all of the sub agents underneath. I think that's a really good place to start. I think more and more we'll have to continue to evolve this. Like I know AWS at their at reInvent, I want to say a week or two ago, recently introduced policies that you can sort of apply to MCP servers and start to apply to your agents. I think people will need to come up with some of these constructs that define, hey, what's our sort of like exchange here? What am I allowed to tell you? What am I not allowed to tell you? Um, I know in some multi-agent patterns, people have talked about like a scratch space where they all write into and they all sort of read out of. I think that could work in some cases, that may not work in others, where maybe you don't want each subagent to have all of the context. And so I think we will have to have different patterns depending on the use case, the sensitivity of the customer, the sensitivity of the sort of data involved in it. And I think the industry itself is also still trying to figure out a bunch of these patterns because agents work better with context. They may not work, you may not want to give them all the context that maybe the agent thinks it needs. And so how do you do this in a safe way? I think something we've tried to enforce at least initially, and then I think we're going to continue to evolve it as we hear from our customers and more patterns emerge.
Hmm. Yeah, very cool to hear about kind of the bleeding edge of the permissioning in that area. I'm curious, since a lot of our listeners may actually be building agents inside of their product, maybe not necessarily agent builders like Agentbricks, but they are building agents that live inside of their products and are exposed to their customers. When should people start considering a multi-agent architecture? Like, where does that architecture really succeed in your experience with customers? Is it, I mean, you mentioned microservices and maybe like reuse, like, so I can see, how that might be useful, but I'm curious, is it like just the time that it might take? Like maybe this is a very complex task, or yeah, tell me about like when you would start recommending that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I would say often what we're seeing is particularly in enterprises, they do have these cases where let's say they have their financial data. And so they've built out an agent that really understands their finance model. It really understands all the data underneath. They may want to reuse that in like a multi-agent context so that they don't have to rebuild, hey, here's what this abbreviation means, or here are all these table and column descriptions. I would say multi-agent definitely adds a level of complexity on there. So it's certainly not needed for all use cases. I think if you're doing something pretty simple where let's say you have an agent that just has one or two tools attached, I don't think those need to be separate agents. I think you could just attach tools to an agent and sort of proceed from there. So I think part of it's composability. And so, what's your goal with this? Is this something you do want to reuse later on? I think reusing that could be helpful. But I do think it does, again, add this layer of complexity. And so, you need to consider like how easy is it to debug? How much latency do you want to introduce? Because every time you call an LLM, there's more additional latency. And so, if you have a very low latency use case, multi agent may not make sense for you. So I think all of those sort of like user requirements and parameters go into making a decision about which exact pattern. But I think people also are leaning that way. It does feel very much like software development, where if you have individual agents responsible for one thing, something goes wrong. Maybe it'll be easier to decide where that went wrong, but it may also be in the handoff between, let's say, the supervisor and the sub agent. And so I think a lot of that tooling we're developing, the industry is developing. And so tracing is very helpful there to kind of know what's going on. That's true for agents themselves. And so I think for us, it's really dependent on how much reuse they want. And then as well, like what's sort of the requirements for their use case and how did they want to think about that? Like again, low latency may not make sense for multi-agent if you have multiple LLM calls happening, for instance.
Got it. Got it. So would roughly the right way to think about it be almost in terms of domain? Like if you have a specific domain or specific job to be done by a particular agent, it might, and maybe that context or domain knowledge gets reused across a number of different tasks. You might want to start thinking about wrapping that into an agent that's used by other orchestration agents or supervisors, as I think you called them. Is that sort of the right way to think about it?
Yeah, that's exactly how we think about it. And that's often what we are seeing is sort of those domains of data. So it could be finance, it could be maybe in that sort of pharmaceutical company example, one of their like drug domains, for example. And so they often have experts involved there who help shape the answers, who validate whether the agent behavior is right. And so if you've already invested all of that time in an agent and then you do need to reuse it in another context, that can be a really good option there. But again, it does depend on sort of the complexity. It does add a layer of complexity in there. And not every agent was built for maybe your use case. So I think evaluating what that agent does, what types of questions it answers, what it was designed to do may mean that you should or should not reuse it. But I think we are starting to see more and more people want to be able to reuse these in the same way in your product. They maybe want to reuse sort of tasks in a workflow, right? You don't want to have to rebuild it every time. Or maybe your colleague built a workflow. So how do you reuse at least what they've done there and sort of give yourself a launching point is a lot of what we're seeing. Is that similar to what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of our customers are thinking about it that way. For them, I think a lot of people have sort of like task-driven agents. I would say, like maybe there's like a specific kind of task, like high-level task that needs to be done inside of their application. So let's say like a support ticketing app is one of our customers, and like maybe just product knowledge is its own agent, and that agent is specifically designed to learn everything it can about one of their customers' apps, like using a help center or internal knowledge, et cetera. But there might be a different agent that's actually working with it to coordinate a response, and maybe both an external response and an internal response. So I think very similar. I'm not sure like if we've seen that domain split before. Maybe because it starts to you maybe start to see that when you're working with so much data, and like you just can't feed all of that data and context into a single agent. But certainly for specific jobs that our customers want to achieve, or specific tasks, end-to-end tasks, I would say, I think we are seeing more multi-agent coordination. And I think it's interesting you bring up the visibility aspect, because in theory it would be easier to debug sub-agent activities, and I think that's true for developers, for a lot of people that are building out AI agents. I've been on the other side of that. I've been trying this other product called Poke by Interaction. It's a really interesting product, very interesting idea. You basically text it over like iMessage, like your personal AI agent. And I think the idea is that all of their interactions between you and Poke are, you talk to Poke, but Poke goes and orchestrates it with a bunch of sub-agents. And it sort of spins up those sub-agents on demand, depending on what integrations you've added. But as a user of Poke, it's interesting because I actually often get errors from the sub-agents, but I have no way of knowing how to fix that, because all I have is like iMessage. And so as an end user, not as a developer, but as an end user of that product, I'm like, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. All I have is this automated bot talking to other automated bots trying to figure out what's going wrong. So it can
and
spiral
surfacing
into
an
chaos
error that you can't fix.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And unlike, traditional web apps where you just like pop open the console, maybe you can figure out what's going on. These agents, like, it's a mystery. You don't know if it's an error, or if it's something that, it's trying to interpret an error and giving you some kind of generic response. It's unclear. So it can be difficult, I think, to implement for user-facing agents, certainly.
Yeah, and that's where I definitely see some of the complexity come in. And so as you do start to have all of these agents, you're coordinating between how does let's say you have the orchestrator, how does it ask the question to the agent in the right way that the agent can interpret that question? And so it's really hard. And so we actually have we have a full research team. They're invested very much in multi-agent, just because I think these handoffs are challenging. And I mean, it's sometimes challenging with humans. How do you communicate in a way that they understand your intent, that you know what tasks to go and complete? Is there sort of back and forth between them where they negotiate. I think there's a lot that can be probably learned from human behavior, but also learned from like software engineering that we can figure out. But it still feels like, I don't want to say like the caveman ages, because I don't think cavemen had, AI, but it still feels very nascent. And so it feels like we're still dealing with like really silly problems where you're like, why did you
Mm.
phrase it that way? Of course, that's why the agent didn't understand it, but how would it know? And so how do you give it context? It's like a bunch of toddlers in a way running around trying to finish a task. It's kind of fun.
Yes.
It's fun to watch, but also frustrating when you're actually trying to get something done.
Yes, 100%, 100%. And that's not, I think that's not the first time we've had the toddlers analogy for AI agents come onto the show. So yeah, super
It's a
interesting. And
theme.
yes, definitely a theme. Um, yeah, kind of stepping back a little bit, I was, thinking about all of the products that Databricks now offers, which seem to have, been released very quickly, which it's been clearly a very ambitious roadmap. And I'm curious, like, how you were anticipating that shift for Databricks customers wanting to, one, I guess, use AI to activate their data. Like, what kind of signals did you see where people were like, we have all this unstructured data and now we want to use LLMs to process it? And also, how did you, kind of decide that people would want to build AI agents on top of Databricks? Like, I'm curious what kind of demand signals you saw that kind of prompted this.
Yeah, really great question. I would say a couple of things. So, Databricks has traditionally always been involved in machine learning. And so, MLflow has been a product for a long time for instrumenting ML models and really understanding and sort of using your data to inform forecasting or sentiment analysis or some of these like more traditional ML problems. And so, there's always been this desire to use particularly like a company's enterprise data, their specific information in order to make better decisions and be more data driven. And so, especially as LLMs and AI started coming online, I think the connection there felt, I don't want to say totally obvious, but I think if you've been in sort of data and ML for a while, it felt pretty obvious that you would need these agents or these models that have general knowledge, don't have any knowledge of your company. They don't know what this acronym means. They don't know how you think what your fiscal year looks like. And so taking all of that into account will make them a lot more effective for a company, especially if you're going to use it for your everyday job. And so a lot of that signal is really what led to the investment in AI and the investment in agents is having the sort of data sit alongside AI can make the AI a lot smarter and a lot better informed about the kinds of answers it gives. And it can also make your data a lot better. And so as you do have hundreds of thousands of tables, you have millions and billions of rows. There's so much data to try to understand out there, both structured and unstructured. And so, how can you make it easier for a human to wrap their head around, give them automation tools? And so, leaning in that direction where we were also bringing sort of AI to data to help people understand it felt like natural to us and really
Mm.
pushing in that direction. So then I would say that the agent piece kind of came along with that, where as we were talking to customers and figuring out what they were struggling with as they were using AI, there's this trust component, governance, really understanding what models are being used, by whom, how, what data was accessed. All of those questions came up. And then our favorite auth came up pretty often too as like a hard problem to solve. And so given we had already done all of this investment in Unity Catalog and permissions and sort of governance, and then sort of these natural, I would say, use cases between AI and data that really sort of motivated our push into building agents and having folks build agents on Databricks. And then I would say it sort of evolved and maybe exploded from there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what you said about kind of the co-location of like data and like where the inference is happening certainly I think helps and motivates that. I'm kind of curious also, like, has that also resulted in a shift in who is using Databricks, like who's logging in? I can imagine that for Agentbricks as a product, there might not just be ML engineers that are trying to build agents for internal use cases or knowledge extraction. So how are you navigating that kind of shift if you're seeing one with who is using that product?
Yeah, it's a really, yeah, I was like, it's a really great question because that is a shift we're starting to see, I would say, in both directions. We're both starting to see like more non-technical users who have an interest in AI, who want to get access to data, And so how do some of these like technical teams really curate the right experience for them so that they get good answers, but they can also self-serve some of this on their own, start to figure it out. And so like our SQL assistant can help you actually like learn SQL, for example, but also Genie does text to SQL and you can sort of curate a space for that. And so you can give them maybe more boxed in experience where you've validated some of the SQL that's being run, the tables underneath, things like that. And then I would also say even in the other direction. So we've had a lot of traditional like data engineering, a lot of traditional data scientists and ML engineers, but we're also starting to see more and more software engineers who are building agents and they do need to connect it to their data as well. So we're also seeing this almost more technical user who I would say is driving changes to how we're thinking about the authoring experience, whether or not, you're using Cursor or another IDE and plugged in that way. How do we make sure you're part of your flow there as well? So I would say we're kind of seeing almost a fork where we're going in both directions.
That's super interesting. And I can imagine that all of the investment that you did in governance and permissioning really helped with that segment of non-technical users, because now you can safely provision that kind of access and give them those capabilities without being worried about, there's going to be context leakage or data leakage in various places when just as somebody is building out an agent and just playing around with data, honestly. So that's really
Yeah.
cool to hear and very cool to see, like, kind of how you're thinking about the AI roadmap overall.
Yeah, and I would say it's even sort of driven big product experience changes. So we even recently introduced what we call Databricks One, which is really a like business user, non-technical focused version of Databricks, where you don't get access to a workspace, you can't go create notebooks. We've removed some of that complexity. It's more sort of curated. Here are the data sets, dashboards, apps that you have access to. And so it's even motivated some of these product changes where I would say we're trying to make it a little easier to use the experience and use the things that you need to get access to without sort of confounding in pieces of the platform that just aren't relevant for you.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Like, not non-technical users may not be able to see, need to see every aspect of a data lake or, how to configure an agent or its policy. So yeah, it makes a ton of sense that you would kind of reshape the product for that user segment as well. So really cool to see how you're thinking about that. Yeah, thank you so much, Elise, for joining us on Future Proof. It was just such a pleasure, like learning about how you're thinking about some of these pretty hairy problems in the ecosystem. So thank you again so much for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on. It was great to talk to you and always great to learn more about the industry as well. So appreciated being on.
Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube to get all the latest episodes. And to view our past episodes, visit us at useparagon.com/futureproof.